But after about 15 minutes on the bottom, more than 4 hours from the surface, like so many of my alarm systems tripped off, a lot of them, like all at once. Very unnerving. In a very small enclosed environment, klaxons going off, and I'm going, what the hell? I didn't detect a hull breach. I wouldn't have realized it anyway. So I said, what's going on? And that's when the training kicks over. That's where the panic response that you've trained for kicks over. And it's like, okay, analyze the problem. What's the root cause of all this? And fortunately, I think I identified it pretty darn quickly. I said, I've got water coming into one of my batteries and it's dumping all that current into the system. I said, I got to isolate that because it's going to start melting things outside the pressure vessel. So theoretically, I had the deepest fire in a submersible ever, at almost 11,000 meters.
Victor Vescovo is an American undersea explorer, private equity investor, and retired naval officer, known for pioneering deep-sea exploration and achieving the Explorer's Grand Slam. He is the first person to visit the deepest points in all 5 of the world's oceans, dive to the Titanic, and reach space, becoming a leading figure in extreme exploration. Victor, welcome to the podcast. This is a real treat for me as a kid growing up watching Jacques Cousteau, and as a lifelong diver, I am fascinated with the ocean and marine exploration. So thank you for joining us.
No, thank you very much for having me.
You've done obviously some amazing work in this area. However, before we get to that, as an icebreaker and a tradition on this podcast, do you have a good drinking story for us?
Oh, yeah. I've got a great drinking story. It's right out of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Most people don't realize it, but way before I really got into ocean exploration, I was a hardcore high-altitude mountain climber for a couple of decades. And one day I found myself trying to climb Mount Elbrus, which is the highest mountain in Europe, actually in Russia, in the Southern Caucasus. And we went through the process and we had a successful summit day and, have our Russian guides who break out their cigarettes at the summit kind of guys. Very, very tough. We actually got back to the refuge they called the Priut on Elbrus that evening. And on the radio, that was actually the day that the coup happened in Moscow. And so all flights were shut off. And we said, you know what? All of us, Russians, Americans, Brits, let's just stay here for a couple of days and see what happens. And so we ended up staying in a small town in Russia called Minalny Vody. And we were hanging out with the Russian guides and everybody else. And, one night, they weren't quite sure what the direction of their country was going to be. So they broke out the vodka. And one thing led to another. And by, early evening, it ended up being, the Russians can outdrink the Brits or they can outdrink the Americans. And so we decided to test that. I was nominated by the Americans, given my youth and my Navy background, to be our representative on the vodka drinking Olympics in the Southern Caucasus with Russian mountain climbers. And it was literally shot for shot until people started bowing out. And it was literally right out of the opening sequence of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Where, that actress is going head to head with a Nepalese Sherpa. And that's where I found myself. I think that I acquitted myself very well. The Russians later admitted that I held my own for quite some time, but I did eventually succumb to the altitude and their incredible ability to drink vodka at altitude. I really could not move for the next day. I was recovering from that endeavor. I probably would have ended up in the hospital had I drunk just a little bit more, but I tried to uphold the national honor with the Russian mountain climbers, and I think I acquitted myself reasonably well. So that happened.
Well, they had home field advantage, so.
Yeah, we'll give that to them. I didn't pass out, thank goodness. I didn't embarrass myself, and I did not get sick, unlike some other participants of the endeavor.
Well, you held up our end well.
I tried. I did my best. I didn't quite really want to say this, but I said yes. And if we ever encounter each other in the United States, like on a mountain in the U.S., we'll have to redo it on my soil. And I'll bet I acquit myself better. But I thank God that never happened again.
Yeah, use good old American whiskey.
Yeah, exactly. I would have given him bourbon, something with some sugar in it would have killed him.
Well, speaking of that must have been an adventure trying to get out of that country when it was in such chaos.
Yeah, it was very unusual. We actually started making contingency plans to hike across the border into Turkey if we were not able to get a flight out. But we actually ended up getting a flight from the south of Russia back to Moscow. We spent the evening in Moscow. They were burning buses and tanks in the street. It was kind of a judgment call, but we had a very good group of people that were, frankly, doing our logistics and planning, and they got us through the capital pretty efficiently and got us to a plane and got us out. So it turned out well, but it was a little bit unusual and a little bit dicey for a couple of days.
Yeah, but a witness to history.
Yeah, it was. It was extraordinary. I mean,
Yeah.
when we left Moscow for the climb, there was a Soviet flag on the top of the Kremlin, and when we came back, it was a Russian flag.
Yeah, that's quite that was quite a moment in history.
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Now, the arc of you, the evolution of you as an explorer, I've studied this quite a bit because I'm really fascinated. And although it probably starts in your childhood, I want to pick it up where you were in college and you decided to learn to fly. Tell us
Yeah.
about that decision.
Well, I was 3 years old when Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and I'd always been fascinated by spacecraft and aircraft. I think there's definitely something genetic about people that have a really strong urge to explore and are just naturally incredibly curious. I think that it's kind of documented now in medical journals that there is a genetic component to it, and I've got it to the nth degree. So I always wanted to fly, and I thought that would be a great avenue to also become an astronaut one day. So I wanted to go in the Air Force, fly fighter planes. And when I tested for Air Force Academy in high school, they said, "You would be great. We would love to have you, but your eyes are terrible. In fact, they're so bad, you're not going to make it. So would you like to be in a missile silo instead?" I said, "That's like the opposite of what I would ever want to do." So I passed on that opportunity, but I always had the desire to learn how to fly. I thought that'd be a wonderful experience. So right when I got to college at 18 years old, I enlisted in a flying program at Stanford. And within a year, I got my private pilot license. And I've been flying ever since. And it has been just not just an incredible joy to fly aircraft and have that incredible freedom and being able to see the world from that perspective, but it also, I didn't realize this, it imbued upon me a whole level of discipline and training and attention to detail and being able to deal with emergencies and dealing with your own fears when all you can rely on is yourself to get your plane and your passengers down safely. It's a great discipline. It's why I'm now a very strong advocate for getting anyone who's remotely interested in flying, getting them into a cockpit.
Well, not only did you learn just to fly, you learned to fly prop, you learned to fly
Yeah,
jets,
well,
and
yeah.
you even learned how to fly a helicopter, which physics says shouldn't fly, but does.
Well, with enough power, you can pretty much do anything if the laws of physics aren't violated. But yeah, once you learn how to fly and you get pretty good, and don't forget, I mean, the hardest rating I think everybody kind of admits to getting is actually instrument flying, flying any aircraft in instrument conditions where you're flying completely in reference to the instruments in your aircraft. That is very tricky and very involved, and you've got to be very, very good. That's really the separation from your recreational flyers and people that are pretty serious. Jets is a whole nother thing, but that's just really, it's just like piston flying, but everything happens much faster. So I think it was just for me, it was always the challenge. What else can I learn? And I even just learned how to fly gliders within the last 2 years and a
Oh,
seaplane.
cool.
It's just, one or two more things to add to my repertoire of skills. Because I think it's a great thing for people to do is to never stop learning and always trying to add new skills to your repertoire, no matter what it is. I just learned how to weld last year as well because I thought that was something useful to know, and it is.
Yeah, my son's a welder. Actually, he started out as a commercial diver welding,
Yeah.
and oh yeah, it's a skill. Staying on this flying, as you said, it gives you a discipline to follow a checklist, follow procedures, but also be calm in the moment. Was there ever a time when you were flying when that was really tested?
Oh, yeah. I think the other element of that is following checklists and being a very methodical, safe flyer. I've been accused of being like a German when I fly. I'm very methodical and kind of emotionless. But the pilot is there a lot, especially these days, for when the automation fails. And then it's the opposite. And then, yes, it is checklist, but sometimes there are things that happen that aren't quite on the checklist. And that's where human adaptability comes to the fore. And so you're trained to deal with those, especially in a helicopter. Half of helicopter training is what do you do when you're at the typical altitude of 1,500 feet, which is pretty low, and your engine quits in a single engine helicopter. Let's just say it becomes very dynamic very quickly, and there's no automation for that. That is pure hand flying, pick your spot where you're going to land, and you manhandle that helicopter until it's right off the ground and you actually hopefully make a safe landing. So yeah, it teaches a lot of discipline, not just on procedures and checklists, but also on how to manage yourself during a very high workload, sometimes quite frightening situation. So for me personally, I've been in a couple of situations. I mean, I've been flying since I was 18. I've had a couple of emergency situations. Flying inadvertently into a cloud is unusual, especially in a helicopter. When I did that once, that's how Kobe Bryant got killed. I was in the exact same type of situation. I was in semi-mountainous terrain, and I all of a sudden ended up in a cloud. I was trained for it. I was an instrument pilot, but I was not in an instrument-rated helicopter. So, you just take care of what you need to take care of. You go up, you tell ATC you've got an emergency, and you work the problem. I've also had an electrical failure in a plane. Again, you just tell ATC, and then you just get on the ground as soon as possible, which we did. So there are any number of things, but that's why when people ask me now, Victor, do you ever get afraid or scared? And the answer is not really. It's more like these days I've been through so much with so many emergencies, whether it's in the mountains or in a plane or anything else, that I just compartmentalize it so quickly and automatically that I just say, more like, okay, I got it. Get out of the way. I need to work the problem. And it's just some people can't do that. Some people just freeze and panic. But I'm kind of the opposite, where I just channel it away from myself until later when I can think about it.
Right. And that's why I thought all of this training and experience you had as a pilot trained you to be able to do that and allow you to do things that we'll get to later. But there's an interesting point. In your master's, you were studying mathematical models of the Cold War European Air War.
Yeah.
And you came to a remarkable conclusion about what tips the balance. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I've always been fascinated with aviation, and also I love math, and I trust math. And so for my master's thesis at MIT, I was involved in an unusual program that had to do with training certain people to apply mathematics to warfare, conventional nuclear. These are the guys that populate the basement of the Pentagon and do all the studies that you hear about in movies and stuff. I was going to be one of those. I eventually took an off-ramp from that because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in the basement of the Pentagon. But yeah, for my thesis, I basically built a very complicated mathematical model of what theater-level air warfare would have been like in Central Europe in the 1990s. What if there had been a war between the Warsaw Pact and NATO? Who would have won in the air? No one had ever built an unclassified mathematical model of that. So I built one, and I ran it several times. But in the process of building that model, you had to understand what affected the outcomes. And in that research, by far the dominant determinant of aerial combat was pilot quality, which kind of makes sense. But it's something that people usually ignore because it's hard to quantify. People love to focus on hardware, radars and munitions and numbers of aircraft. But any really good pilot will tell you that you put a great pilot in a bad airframe, he will beat a bad pilot in a good airframe all day long. And therefore, that's why there's pretty much a strong correlation between the number of hours that pilots fly and the quality of the aerial combat that they practice that directly determines who will win in air combat and therefore at the theater level. And that became a key element of my analysis, and it back-tested very well against historical conflicts all the way back to World War II and World War I.
Yeah, I found that a heartening conclusion that man still makes a difference, notwithstanding the technology. It still comes down to the person at the stick. Well, these days it's all electronics, but
well, see, there you go. That's what people realize. Oh, it's all electronics. Oh, it's all automation. But what people forget is war is chaos. And people always underestimate the enemy gets a vote. They're trying to break your stuff. And the human ability to adapt is absolutely crucial in warfare. And so, yes, in the sterile environs of a cubicle or in a think tank, people can say, oh, this system's going to do that, or that system's going to do that. When at the end of the day, they break, especially in the chaos of war. And then it's up to the pilot. 80 to 90% of aircraft that are shot down in combat, they never even knew who did it. They never saw their adversary. It's sneak attack and ambush. It's the same way often with ground warfare. And people just forget that. It's not so antiseptic that it's all, electronics and hardware, but that's what's easy for people to focus when they can't appreciate or quantify the chaos of war or life, frankly.
Yeah. Now, as a pilot, if you had your choice, and I'll pick any plane flown earlier than 1950, any plane built earlier than 1950, what would be your favorite plane that you'd really like to fly?
P-51 Mustang.
Oh, yeah. That's sweet.
Yeah, the Rolls-Royce of aerial combat. It was probably one of the most perfect aircraft ever built. And what I love about that story is that originally that plane built by North American in the U.S. was not a very good plane. It actually had an underperformance issue. The engine was not very good, but it had a great fuselage. It wasn't until the Brits said, hey, why don't you put our Merlin engine in your amazing fuselage? When that happened, it was like, Reese's Pieces. It was like a match made in heaven. They fit together perfectly with great range. And that's what built the perfect fighter. It wasn't exactly what they thought it was going to be at the beginning, but we adapted, we modified, and then we made something near perfect.
Yeah, that's just a classic. It's still flying. You still see it at air races.
Yeah, it's an amazing piece of engineering.
Have you ever got to fly one?
No. I'd love to one day. Tom Cruise, if you're out there, I'd love to fly with you.
Let me switch a bit on the gears here, because you spoke about in combat, the other side gets a vote and is trying to kill you. But then you took up climbing. Now, and not only climbing, but high altitude climbing in a place where the mountain and the environment is out to kill you. I mean, you're up in the death zone at some of the heights that you were climbing. What attracted you to climbing?
Yeah, well, whether it's a conscious enemy like in warfare or it's nature itself, I think it teaches a good discipline that you are always dealing, whether you realize it or not, even driving home in traffic, you're dealing with adversarial conditions with some level of chaos. So whether you realize it or not, you are constantly in risk management mode to a greater or lesser extent. What attracted me to mountains, and the first mountain I climbed when I was 21 years old, was Kilimanjaro in Africa. I had never done any major climbing before other than 14ers in California and Colorado. But that was my first really big mountain, up to 18,000 feet. And I just loved it. I loved the changing scenery. I loved the process, the multi-day nature of it, how it was really testing you physically and mentally. And I got hooked. And once I got hooked, I really wanted to test my ability and learn new skills. And so I never set out to climb the seven summits like some people do. I just wanted to climb higher and higher and get higher and higher skills and enjoy myself. I enjoyed the process. And that's still how I do things. I don't explore or do the things I do for notoriety or to, oh, look what I did. I really and truly just enjoyed the process and the feeling of accomplishment and testing yourself and coming out the other side intact and even better. And so, yeah, that's why I took up mountain climbing, because I thought it was a hell of a challenge. And I love the scenery and I love the process. And I just kept doing it for decades, to the point where one day I found myself on Everest.
The feeling that you get at the top of a mountain. Now, I've done some climbing, but not near in the magnitude that you have. Probably the best mountain I've done is Mount Rainier. But, when you get to the top, there's just, I don't know, it's almost an indescribable feeling. As if you have a good view and you're looking out and you've put in such an effort, you've, gone through crevasse fields and, the rope team gets up there. How did it feel to you to be at the top?
Well, getting to the top of Everest was a unique feeling because it took me 2 tries. And on the second try, we actually went up in a mild storm. So the good news on that was that there were no other climbing teams really in front of us. There was only 1 or 2, but we didn't have to wait in lines. That was huge. The downside was it was brutally cold, incredibly windy, and it was just a beat down to get to that summit. But we did. But then when we got there, to answer your question, I felt 3 distinct feelings in pretty rapid succession. The first was, frankly, I think any climber feels this, it's relief. It's, oh, thank God. We got here. We're done. I'm not going to get injured. I'm not going to get sick. The weather isn't going to close in. Thank God. Jesus, thank God we made it. Now we can go down. You just get that sense of, oh, good. Can't go up anymore. I don't have to go up anymore. The second was, wow, this is awesome. This is really cool. Now, we couldn't see very far when we got to the summit, only a couple hundred meters because it was in a storm. But yeah, there was no higher place on the planet than where we were, and we were on it. And so at a certain point when you take a picture, what have you, you go, I am standing higher than any human being on the planet's surface, which is a pretty cool feeling. And then the third feeling pretty rapidly after that was, this is really dangerous. we need to leave like now, because no one is going to come up here to come save us if we get in trouble. And every moment that we're here is increasing our risk. So we spent 15 minutes on the summit and then got the hell out of there.
Yeah, as every experienced climber knows, the climb is not over and successful until you're successfully down the mountain.
Yeah, it only counts if you make it down. Just ask Sir Lane Mallory. It's just like a pilot. Your landings need to, your takeoffs need to equal your landings.
But that experience though, if you just took a helicopter to the top of Everest, it would not be the same.
It'd be different. Because people have done that. People don't realize a helicopter, you don't just, okay, let's get more power and go up to it is highly unstable. Flying a helicopter at 29,000 feet would be an insane piloting experience. I would be very, very much on edge because the slightest perturbation in the air could flip that helicopter over, and that's unrecoverable. You can't recover from something like that in a helicopter. Maybe you could in a plane, but there's that. But yeah, it's just an amazing feeling when you get up there and feeling it is dangerous because they don't call it the death zone to be melodramatic. When you're above 8,000 meters, you're simply dying more slowly. Even if you stop in so-called rest, you're not resting. You're just
dying.
Yeah, you're dying just really slow, and it's going to be even harder to get back up. So it's a very strange place.
Yeah, my point was, though, that the experience that you get up there is also a product of all the years it took and then the months it took and the step after step of just a grinder just getting up that mountain. That's a spice that adds to that experience at the top.
Well, it's like anything. Something is really only valuable if you have to put a lot of work and effort into it. And that's doing it correctly. To do Everest correctly, you need many, many years, I think, of really solid training to prepare you for the disaster that could happen if you're careless, or to help other people if they get in trouble, which is a responsibility that you have. And it took me 2 tries to get to Everest. So I trained for over a year the first time. Got to Everest, I got frostbite when I got to Camp 2, and it wasn't going to work out. And I had to make the incredibly difficult call to abandon my attempt while the rest of the team kept going up. But you have to have that discipline. And I think it's the ability to say, no, not today, that keeps you alive, because that mountain's not going anywhere. But I had to redo all that training again, for a year and a half, even more intensely than I did before, so I could prepare better. But it's that preparation, whether it's for mountain climbing, for ocean exploration, for flying. Any expert will tell you that the key to success is in the preparation. One of my heroes of exploration is Roald Amundsen. And he has a famous quote that I would be paraphrasing, and it said, luck is nothing more than really good preparation. And what other people call bad luck is a lack of preparation. I truly believe that.
Yeah, Amundsen is just at that pantheon of explorers that we all just kind of admire, because the things he did. But he taught us also about risk management.
He made it look easy. And that's what I kept saying all over on all my expeditions is, we're going to try and make this as boring as possible. We want to make this look easy, repeatable, etc. That's the epitome of risk management and being a successful explorer or pilot, is that you make it look like not that hard of a thing. It's the people that do things in an epic way where, oh my God, this happened, and oh my God, that happened, or this person died. Those people didn't really do it well. I think it was fascinating to see how the British treated Amundsen when he came back from the South Pole. And they, of course, lost their expedition with Robert Falcon Scott. They died. And they were almost upset with Amundsen that he succeeded in such a clean way where no one got killed or even seriously injured on his attempt. He made them look bad. But, I mean, sorry, but that's how you're supposed to do exploration and extreme activities. You do them like a stunt person. You analyze them, you train, and then you do them with as little drama as possible.
And he had better intel. I mean, he really studied how to do it from, I believe, the Inuit, but
The Sami, the people of the northern Scandinavian peoples. Yeah, I mean, he was a Norwegian.
Yeah.
He would go out there and test his equipment. He was also ruthless in personnel. It's not well known, but he fired people from his expedition because he tested them out and realized that they wouldn't work out really well on the long expedition. They killed and had other dogs eat the other dogs because that was the only way logistically to do it well. Scott and his team, they used, animals and machinery that both broke down. That didn't work. But he prepared, he did the math, and again, he made it look easy.
Now, you had a saying that I wrote down here that the biggest risk is complacency plus ego. What did you mean by that?
Me? Okay, well, yeah, that can get you in a lot of trouble if you have complacency. Complacency just kills because every time you do something, the earth and the risks that you take have no memory. They don't know that you've done this 100 times successfully. They don't care. They are just as happy to kill you on your 101st attempt to do something as your first. So you have to treat every risk like it's coming after you again, just like the first time. And ego is what feeds complacency. Oh, I've done this 50 or 100 times before. I'm awesome. I'm great. I think the best explorers and the best risk managers have a great sense of humility, knowing that some days they're performing at their top level, some days you're not. Some days the conditions are great, sometimes they're not. You have to check your ego at the door to properly assess risk. And you also absolutely have to be willing to say, as I did earlier, not today. It's not working. And that's not a badge of shame. It's not a failure. And yes, you may spend enormous resources trying to do something and then you abort. But, there's the old saying in flying, right? There are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. And ego is a big part of that.
Yeah, when my son went off to start his diving career, he and I had both been scuba diving forever, but I just reminded him that it's every diver's prerogative to call the dive. If he doesn't feel like going, if something hanks him up, weather doesn't look right, it's your right to call the dive. You could always dive tomorrow.
Yeah, it's just that little voice that people always talk about. That's your subconscious, and it's a pattern recognition device. So if you just don't even feel comfortable and you can't even explain why ignore that? If you ignore it, there's probably a reason and not a good one, like, get there-itis, or you get summit fever as a climber, or there's other external pressures. You have to become immune to those. And one of the wonderful things about my expeditions is that I did not have sponsors. I was not beholden to anyone other than myself for the success of my expeditions, and I keep them that way. And because of that, because I don't have sponsors, because I pay for everything myself, it makes it much easier to de-risk a situation by saying, no, not today. Let's fix it and let's try again later.
Let's go to the expedition and the technological challenges to dive to the 5 deepest parts of the ocean, the deepest part of each of the 5 oceans in a submersible. Now, you had a great climbing career, all 7 summits, both poles. What prompted you to go deep?
Well, at that point, I had been climbing high altitude for several decades, and I do believe it's a young person's game. I think you can start taking increased risk while your physical abilities start to slowly deteriorate, and that starts widening the risk cone. I mean, you can just tell how I'm talking. That's how I view things. And so I just had the humility to say, I pretty much accomplished everything I wanted to do personally climbing. I got invited to go to K2 a couple of times. I said, I'm not a professional climber.
Ooh,
and there are parts of
that's a killer
K2.
mountain.
Well, it is. And, I studied K2, okay, maybe I can do it, maybe I can't. I think, I climbed Everest. I'm pretty sure physically, given the right day and conditions, I could have climbed K2. But there are parts of K2 where literally, I don't care how good a climber you are. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you're not coming back. And I don't like those kinds of risks where it is completely outside my control and I'm literally rolling the dice with my life and those of my friends. So I just said no to that. But I respect people who have done it. I respect them immensely. But the five deeps came around because I was looking for another type of challenge. I've been flying a lot. I've kind of gotten all the ratings I wanted. And I heard about Richard Branson, who had his so-called five dives project, but the technology that he chose didn't quite work out and he abandoned the project. And I said, well, it doesn't violate the laws of physics to do it. So what would it take? How could you do it? And I started sitting in my office trying to sketch it out. I talked to a few experts in the area, and I realized, oh, okay, it'll take a lot of money, it'll take a lot more effort, but yes, it could be done. There's no guarantee, but I thought, it's the year 2015 when I started thinking about it. I said, I can't believe we haven't been to the bottom of 4 of the 5 world's oceans. That's ridiculous. I almost
Well, they
had a
they
I
didn't
had a
even know
person.
where some of them were.
No, they didn't. No, I mean I found that out later. We really didn't know where
Crazy.
they were. And it was actually a personal affront to me, to my sensibility, that we as human beings had not done that. I went, how lazy are we as a species that we have not done that? That's ridiculous. And I come from a culture in Texas of, you can't just wait around for government or other people to do things. You get in that saddle and you say, all right, get her up. Let's figure this out and let's get it done. And that's kind of what I did. And it was fun. And I thought, what else am I going to do with my abilities to finance something like this? And I could pilot it as well. So it satisfied me. And I think, honestly, the fact that I funded it, I was the pilot, and I, in some respects, was part designer, especially for the human factors. I was deeply involved in the expedition planning. Being all of those things allowed for a tight decision cycle that made it possible to do in about 4 or 5 years, which if government or any other organization had tried doing that, it would have been impossible.
And we're going to get to that in a moment. But, to me, when I was looking at it, it seemed like the perfect person at the right opportunity with the right resources because of your experience as a pilot, climbing, you're a technologist. It seems that there was just a perfect point where all this intersected and the right person at the right time.
Well, it wasn't
And
just me. I have to throw that in there. There is no way I could have done this alone. I was, in some respects, the prime mover of it, but without Patrick Leahy of Triton Submarines, who was right at the moment in his career where he put a prototype design out there, but he really, really wanted to do it. Or Rob McCallum, my expedition leader, who is, he's already in his prime as one of the leading expedition leaders in the world. A new sonar had become available that was the most powerful ever put on a ship. I got serial number 1. All these things seem to just come together where sometimes you scratch your head and go, I don't know, is there such a thing as fate? I don't know, but it sure felt that way sometimes.
oh, it did. And, to me, first of all, there were such technological challenges to what you wanted to accomplish because it wasn't just a one-off, let's go down, back up, and then it's the vehicle is going to be trashed. You were trying to develop technology that could be used over and over again to extend science and to give science and explorers a vehicle to go down there and see what was there and do the science. What were the technological challenges that you were facing in order to create that next generation, that big step in that technology?
Well, I think when I started on the Five Deeps expedition, it was mischaracterized in the press where at one point I think I told the engineers, hey, just put me in a steel ball on a cable. That'll be enough. That's taken way out of context. I was actually trying to provoke them to make as simple a design as possible, not to have a gold-plated, this can do everything submersible. It was always my intention to build a submersible that could repeatedly go to the bottom of the ocean for science, for any other endeavor, to build the technology, because that's what I do. That's what I do as my day job as a venture capitalist. I try and help build technologies that advance us as a species. And I'll give a lot of credit to Patrick Leahy of Triton Submarines, who really definitely encouraged that viewpoint as well. He said, no, Victor, it needs to be a two-person sub. Can't just be one. It needs to be certified as a commercially viable craft, which had never been done before. And that required a lot more money and more time to build it to that level. But because of that, I was able to easily bring in non-aquanauts to be in the submersible. It wasn't experimental. It was commercially rated. I had two heads of state in the submersible over its 4-year operating history under me. And therefore, it was incredibly important and I think enhanced by Patrick to make it this amazing scientific vessel.
For most people, probably just don't really understand how deep and then the pressures involved and just the technological issues that you had to overcome.
Oh my gosh. Well, there are a lot of ways to explain it, but the easiest one too is that everybody's obsessed with the Titanic. They go, oh, the deepest wreck in the world is the Titanic. It's at literally only 4,000 meters, which is still pretty damn deep. The deepest part of the ocean is 11,000 meters deep. It's almost 3 times deeper than Titanic. The outside ambient pressure is 16,000 pounds per square inch. That's like 3 or 4 automobiles on top of each other on your fingernail. That's how much pressure it is. In fact, if you summed up the entire amount of pressure on the submersible when it was at full ocean depth on every square inch of the whole sub, it'd be like 3 aircraft carriers sitting on top of the sub. Those are insane pressures. Another way to put it is you can launch a spacecraft into space, and it can stay up there for 6 months, a year, even longer with proper supplies. You cannot do that with a submersible at full ocean depth. It is slowly disintegrating. It's trying to be ripped apart by that pressure, the corrosive salt water, the freezing cold temperatures. It is a brutally harsh environment. And when you go down to the bottom of the ocean, you're going from 1 atmosphere of pressure to 1,100. So the whole submersible is shrinking. And then when it comes back up, it's expanding. So any engineer will tell you that's the last thing you ever want to do to a mechanical device is significant compression and relaxation. You're just torturing the hell out of it, where eventually it will fail. So you had to design this thing to breathe. The viewing portals were the most challenging thing to design because they literally had to shrink 1/4 of an inch into the submersible and then back out again every dive and not leak or collapse.
Yeah, the technological challenges. Now, the first vessel was the Trieste, way back when.
1960.
And yeah, and that goes down. There's 2 inside, but there's the way it was. It's just big steel ball and this huge tank of what was it, gasoline?
Yep, gasoline's lighter than water, so it was like a big balloon.
Yeah, and it went down, went up, but just one time, correct?
Correct. And they were only down on the bottom for 20 minutes because they couldn't easily maneuver. And they got silted out. They pushed the thrusters a little bit and they kicked up all the dust. They couldn't see anything. And it was about to get dark on the surface and they didn't want to breach the surface in the dark. And so they got back up and they only did the one time. Now, they weren't trying to break any records. It was more just a technological achievement for the U.S. Navy. And nothing happened again for over 50 years. No one went back down for 50 years, not until Jim Cameron went down in his submersible.
And then Cameron goes down. And he's got the next generation. It's still a single person. But what fascinated me was when you first started out, you were thinking of, well, just finding his submersible, refitting it, and then you found it was in such bad shape. But that shows you just how incredibly harsh it is to be down in that environment, that even his vessel, the next generation, couldn't do more than one dive.
Yeah, well, I do give an immense amount of credit for Jim on the Deep Sea Challenger. It was a wonder of engineering. They used syntactic foam for the first time, which made it a much smaller vessel. The steel capsule he used, while it was less expensive than the titanium one that I built, it did the job. But I went there to Woods Hole and saw the Deep Sea Challenger, and I went, oh my gosh, how did Jim, be in that configuration for as long as he was? Because he's a big guy and he had to crouch down in it. There was only a single viewport. So physically what he did was much more difficult than what I did. And it only did the one dive. And I think the biggest problem that I saw with the submersible was, just like with mine, that salt water wants to get to those batteries. And if they penetrate in those batteries, salt water and high powered electronics do not play well together. and it caused, significant issues for him, and it caused significant issues for me until we perfected our batteries. So yeah, after looking at that, I was encouraged by the guys at Woods Hole. They said, you're better off, given that it's been several years, just go with a clean sheet design, and you can make something that potentially could be highly reusable, could potentially seat two people, and that may be the direction you want to go. And it'll cost you just as much, which wasn't completely true, but that's the direction I went.
Now, we could spend hours just talking about the design and the manufacture and the issues creating this new technology. But you did make a point about, since it wasn't government, that you had freer reign and probably a quicker turnaround. And there was one incident, I believe, where there was a call regarding where to put the joystick. I thought that was sort of illuminating as to how quickly the turnaround was. Tell us that story.
Yeah, I use this as an example when people say, well, why don't government do it, or how were you able to do it so cost effectively? And it's a brilliant example. It actually happened where one day I was sitting in my desk, doing my day job of venture capital in Dallas, and I got a call from Triton. And I think I'm being a little loose with the history, but this is the general tenor of it. They said, hey, Victor, we're now trying to figure out where to put the control column. And given that you're the test pilot, are you right-handed or left-handed? Which side do you want it on? Because we forgot. And, how high do you want it? So I said, okay, let me give you a call back. So I'm sitting at my, chair in my office, and I'm literally playing around with it. Like, where would I want it ideally? And I called him back and I said, it's got to be on the right-hand side. I want it this many inches laterally, this many inches on the Z-axis. They wrote it all down. They went, great. You're sure? And I went, yeah, do it. And that was it. How many committees would you have had to go through? How many people would have had to have been involved? How many iterations to do that in a government/academic setting? And oh, by the way, it would not have ended up where I wanted it as the pilot. You know that. Everybody knows it. Yeah. And that's why it was so efficient. But that really happened.
Yeah. Like I say, we could spend a lot of time. Triton did just a phenomenal job of overcoming so many unknown unknowns in order to get that sub done. But I want to go now to the first dive. It's in the Puerto Rican Trench.
Well, that was not the first dive I made in the submersible. We did test dives in the Bahamas, even down to 5,000 meters. But the first of the 5 deeps, and when we were going for what was it, an 8,000 meter dive, that was, the starting gun of the 5 deeps expedition. That was really dicey because the sub wasn't working great.
Yeah, and it what I didn't understand was the hatch was leaking and had a problem that was persistent that had to be.
Yeah, I mean, it's a high tolerance hatch because you had to develop a hatch that could close efficiently at 1 atmosphere, but also be complete secure 1100 and then, flex out. It's not simple. And people go, oh gosh, how hard could it be to make a hatch that doesn't leak? Well, actually for a full ocean depth submersible, it's quite hard. That you can also actually open with one arm. That's tricky. And the O-rings have to be perfect to do what they need to do, et cetera. So, we worked those problems, and the manipulator arm was a constant source of issues. And it wasn't on the Puerto Rican Trench dive that we basically took off the manipulator arm. And that allowed us, without getting too technical, the ability to use the electrical connections that were supposed to be used for the manipulator to solve some other electrical issues. Because I didn't need the manipulator to do the first dive. I wasn't retrieving anything. But that was the difference.
So I want to take you to that first deep dive, Puerto Rican Trench. Mm-hmm. And you finally, green lights to go. You're about to get into the sub. And this is going to be the first real dive to the deep. When I was thinking about that,
my first solo dive was to the bottom of the Atlantic.
How do you think Yeager felt when he was getting in that plane to try and break the sound barrier? Because it seemed just the same. You had technology trying to expand into a new part of the environment. And
well, I mean, gosh, I would never compare myself to Chuck Yeager. He's an icon and a legend. I'm just a small insect compared to what that man accomplished. And they didn't even know if it was physically possible to break the sound barrier. People thought it would be like a wall. It would disintegrate the aircraft. I don't think people had the same issues with descending to the bottom of the Puerto Rican Trench. There were more issues with just, technologically, can it survive the depth? But I had every confidence that it was going to be able to survive the depth. The more issue were the secondary electrical systems. But yeah, I mean, when you strap into a prototype submersible, you're going down to the bottom of the Atlantic to 8,000 plus meters. It's your first solo dive. Yeah, there's a little anxiety there, but you compartmentalize it and you just get on with the job. And I remember watching the great movie, The Right Stuff, where, he even had like a broken rib when he did that flight. But it's just a, get it done. This is the job kind of thing. And yeah, for me, it wasn't about, oh my gosh, this is so scary or this is so historic or whatever. It was more about, okay, right now my job is to test pilot this thing. My job is to try and get it down and get it back safely and to log what goes right, what goes wrong, explore the bottom, do what science I can. You just get in that mode.
Yeah, and that's a mutual friend of ours, Clash, had interviewed, I believe, Yeager. And I think Yeager said, when he was asked about it, said he just was surprised the damn thing didn't break apart.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I think for me, it was a little bit similar where I wasn't necessarily surprised, but I was happy that it was amazing. We had all these issues with the submersible in the days leading up to the dive. And then in a 36-hour period, Triton solved pretty much all of them. And it was like a flawless dive. I mean, nothing bad happened on the dive. It was like, got in the sub, everything worked, went according to the plan, got to the bottom of the Atlantic, did some surveying, came back up, and there you go. Bob's your uncle.
Almost. So you close the hatch and you're just about to dive, and you're finally getting there. The time is there. How did you feel right before they gave you the green light to go down?
I was excited. And I think it really just came down to, you go through a lot of pre-checks. We checked the sub the night before. We checked the sub in the morning. I do pre-checks right before I dive, and they all came back green. And so when I finally got the green Christmas tree behind me, and I checked into the surface, and they said, "You're clear to dive." It was exciting. I was excited because I had a lot of confidence that this was going to be a good dive. Maybe I kind of had a premonition, but everything felt good. Like there'd been this sea change in the mood, in the craft, like it was all coming together, and it did.
Now, as you go down, if I recall right, as you're descending down, all of a sudden you hear these pops and different noise.
Okay.
And that was a bit unnerving, wasn't it?
Well, I think any pilot will tell you, and it's the same with a submersible, probably more so. Every machine, even a car, they have their own unique acoustic signatures, and we get to know them over time. Now, in a submersible, it's a little different because every pop and crack, in the back of your mind, you're wondering, is that bad or good? You just don't know because they don't make normal sounds. And then there's the whir of the fans. And so I had to learn over the first 10 or 20 dives how the craft sounded. And I didn't fully appreciate that until later, that people that came into the submersible for the first time, like other scientists or other pilots, they didn't know those sounds. So everything got them on edge, and I was the calming presence saying, no, that's normal. So there was a fascinating development, though, where there was actually a metal cable that strung around the circumference of the pressure vessel to keep it completely spherical. And what we didn't realize until it happened was when it got to about 6,000 meters, it actually wouldn't slowly compress around the sphere. It would actually have a step change. And so there'd be like a rubber band snapping a little bit, and it would give you a thunk. First time it happened, it scared the hell out of me. But then I remembered the words of Don Walsh, the first person to the bottom of the ocean that had a plexiglass window crack on his dive to the bottom of the ocean. He said, hey, if you can hear it, you're fine. Because if it's catastrophic, you're not going to hear it. And so I just kept the dive up. And it wasn't until later that we figured out what was happening. It puzzled the engineers for a while, and they went, oh my gosh, it tensions in a stepwise function, not in a linear fashion. And so from then on, I had a little fun with people going down with me, where I wouldn't tell them that was going to happen and just wait for it and watch their reaction.
So you get down to the bottom of the Puerto Rican Trench.
Yeah.
and you hit bottom, and there's number one. What's it feel like, and as you're looking out there, that you finally made it the first dive? Everything's A-okay.
Well, it comes back to that same description I gave of climbing mountains. At first, it was relief. It's like, oh my gosh, this submersible works. This thing that we just talked about and drew diagrams of 4 years ago, I'm actually in it. I'm actually driving around the bottom of the Puerto Rican Trench like a kid with a go-kart. This is awesome. It was so exciting. And more than that, I also started doing the math going, okay, I'm here and I'm fine. And we're at more than 8,000 meters. That's 2/3 of full ocean depth. If this submersible can handle this, it can probably handle Challenger Deep. So it was a big vote of confidence. Now, that being said, the next dive we did in the Southern Ocean, I think it was remarked in the book, Expedition Deep Ocean, that while the Puerto Rican Trench was the starting gun for the expedition, the Southern Ocean was the forge. That was a tough
Definitely.
expedition.
And that's what I want to talk to you.
Environmentally, socially on the ship, just everything. That was, they don't call it, here be monsters on the maps for no reason. That is a tough place to go.
Now, for folks, most people don't even know the existence of the Southern Ocean, much less what it's like. Can you describe that for people?
Well, when you ask them to name the 5 oceans, they usually get the first 4, and then they don't know about the Southern Ocean, which is the ocean that's around Antarctica. And it's defined by latitude. And it is brutal weather, and it's because there's no land mass at that latitude. So when storms start, they can swirl around the entire world, picking up energy and power, and there's no land mass to stop them. And so when you go down to those latitudes, it's really rough. You get heavy storms, snow, ice, brutal cold, even during the summer, and the waves are really big. I think we were down there for about 30 days, and we had 2 days where we tried to dive, and on one of them there was a collision between the sub and the ship, and I was in the sub. So we did have one successful dive, and thank heavens that was the day that went down to the bottom of the Southern Ocean in the South Sandwich Trench, which had never been mapped before. No one even knew where the bottom was. We had to map that first and find it. Then when we found it, I made the dive. And even on that dive, I lost all communications with the surface after 4,000 meters. So that was stressful for all sides.
Yeah, you go down, and I don't know if it's, well, describe, because it's not like a radio. How do you communicate with the surface?
It's an acoustic modem. So if you think about the old style modems from the 90s, with the clicks and the beeps, it was sort of like that. It converted sound into sound waves, and they traveled much slower than radio. So at the bottom of the ocean, Challenger Deep, it took 7 seconds for signal to go from the surface down to the bottom. So that's a 14-second round trip. That's longer than it takes to get radio to the moon. So you were even further away in terms of communications than the moon when you're at the bottom of Challenger Deep using an acoustic modem. But it's also much more subjected to environmental conditions, and that's what happened at the Southern Ocean, was that there was a very thick thermocline, a differential in pressure. And below 4,000 meters, all the sound waves were bouncing back. So when I went below it, my signals were bouncing down, and from the surface, they were bouncing back up. So I lost comms. And that was a tough decision for me, because the procedure with submersibles is if you ever lose communications for more than 30 minutes, you're supposed to come back up because they don't know what happened to you. But given where we were and the difficulty of just launching and recovering the submersible and how hard it was, and I didn't even know when we would ever get to go back there, I decided to continue the mission because everything else was fine with the sub. And there was nothing wrong with the comm software. It was environmental. So I made the call to go down. And I decided when I got to the bottom, which I did, I would stay down exactly 1 hour, and then I would come back up. And it turned out later that someone on the ship that knew me quite well, he said, yeah, I think Victor's okay. And if he does, he'll probably go down, stay down 1 hour, and then come up. And that's exactly what I did. So it's nice being predictable for your staff. But they really didn't know what had happened. And it wasn't clear if something catastrophic had happened or not. And so I got a stern talking to by Patrick when I got back to the surface, but we revised our procedures after that such that at pilot's discretion, given these were pretty exotic dives, that I got to make the call of what to do. I was not beholden to come back up just for a communications failure if that was the only thing that was going wrong.
Now, in addition to just making it to the bottom, the technological challenge, there was also a lot of science being done.
Mhm.
Can you now in the Southern Ocean, since no one had ever been there, what science was being done there? What did you discover?
Well, just to start off with, we had to map it. No one had ever mapped the South Sandwich Trench, which is a 1,000-mile long trench that has a lot of tectonic dynamics, geologic ones that the geologists were fascinated by. And then there were the samples that we could get using the landers that went along with the sub down to the bottom of the ocean. In fact, very sadly, our chief scientist, Dr. Alan Jameson, he lost 2 of his own landers that he brought with him. They never came back. It was that brutal of an ocean. There was one day where, 2 of the landers just didn't show up. One of mine didn't show up until much, much later. And so we were able to collect some samples with creatures that had been isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years. And I think people are surprised, but we weren't, that on virtually every dive that we made to a deep ocean trench, we found new species. And it was almost like, well, why wouldn't you? No one has ever sampled these areas, and they've been isolated geologically for millions of years, potentially. And so, yeah, we did a lot of really good science. And we took water samples and going down to the Southern Ocean and getting the heat retention, the salinity. That was all data that had never been collected before. And very importantly, during 10 months, we went around the world to the 5 deep ocean trenches, and we took water samples. That's a baseline of data that we don't think has ever been built before. And so this was done by the same equipment in a 10-month period with the same scientists even. So therefore, I think in the future, hopefully people will be able to use that baseline data for things like climate models or comparison studies or things of that nature.
Take us to the third dive, the Java Trench. Now, first you had a problem just even getting, well, if you even got permission. Tell us that story.
Arg. Yeah. That was,
pirates.
Yeah. Well, permitting became one of the biggest issues, and is frankly, I consider maybe the largest barrier to deep ocean research is just getting permits from governments. It's unfortunate, but they have a reflexive nature to say no, because I think they're suspicious, or there's this bureaucratic inertia to say no. Why take any risk, right? So for the Java Trench, I actually went to Indonesia, in Jakarta. I met with scores of scientists, military personnel, government people, and they were all very encouraging, and went through, I think it was 17 different ministries that we had to go to get approval, any one of whom could say no. But for over a year, everyone was going, no, it'll get done, it's all good, this is great. And then we got to Bali, we mounted the crew, we were on our way to go to the bottom of the Java Trench, which we had identified as the deepest point in the Indian Ocean. No one had ever done that before. No one even knew where that was. And we kept waiting for the permit. We kept getting told that, no, it's coming. It'll get to you just in time. Okay, fine. We're literally over the dive site. And that's at that point I said, I'm going to dive. I'm in international waters. I'm not going to touch anything. I'm not going to take any samples. I'm just going to test the equipment. Just happens to be the deepest point in the Java Trench. According to the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, that is not marine research, and I have every right to do this. So I dove. When I came back up, very quickly thereafter, we got word from the Indonesian government that we had violated their national sovereignty, which actually is not a reason why you can deny someone permission to dive. They said, you violated national security rules. It's like, that's not a thing. So, okay, you could have accused us of diving without a marine scientific research permit, but that's not defined by the UN. All these other reasons you're citing are not valid, so we don't get your point. That being said, what I learned from that and a lot of other experiences, the law on the sea is whatever someone wants it to be. If they bring a warship out, which they didn't, they can tell you what to do, and you just argue about it later at the UN, whatever. So at that point, we couldn't go back to Indonesia. And this was during the first year of COVID. We couldn't go to Australia to refuel because they were going to quarantine us for about a month. We literally got a map and go, like, where the hell do we go? We didn't have enough fuel to get to India or Sri Lanka. And so we went, oh my gosh, we're going to have to go to East Timor. It's the only country within range that we can dock and get our people off and refuel. And of course, that was the old Portuguese pirate place, right? So there was a lot of
Well,
jokes on the
speaking
ship
of,
about that.
well, there's more than that. Your captain changed the flag while you
Well,
were
he
down.
did.
Tell us
Well, I
about
don't know if
that.
he did it, but somebody did. The funny story there was that I'll never forget. After we made that decision that we were going to go to East Timor, we started steaming east. I came out on deck. I was a little, decompressing from the dives, and on the fantail of the ship, I saw that someone had put out a pirate flag. This is like at 1 a.m. I'm like, really? So I immediately went up to the captain's cabin and I said, "Hey, Captain, there's a pirate flag on the back of my ship. You know, two questions. One, that's coming down, right?" And he said, "Yeah, yeah, the boys are just having a little bit of fun." He's a Scottish captain, very gruff, best captain I've ever known. He said, "Oh, the boys are just having a bit of fun, Well, yeah, we'll take it off before we get into port." I went, "Good." Second question, why is there a pirate flag on my ship? And that's when he responded. He said, "Oh, Victor, you scratch a Scot, you'll find a pirate." Yeah. So being of part Scottish ancestry myself, I sympathized, and all was good.
Excellent. Now that trench, though, um, scientifically is very important for not only the biology but the geology because
Oh
of
yeah,
the tectonic. Yeah, can you explain that?
yeah. We had on the ship the pressure drop, one of the most powerful and modern sonars you could put on a civilian vessel, Kongsberg EM-124, and we scanned the entire length of the Java Trench to find its deepest point. And actually, it was in a surprising place. It was south of Bali. It wasn't on either of the two edges, which we had actually sort of expected. But we did identify some major seamounts in the trench. One of them was characterized by the chief geologist on board. She said, "That looks like a doorstop. That's not good. That is simply sitting there with these plates moving against each other, building up pressure. When that thing goes, it's not going to be good." And I don't think they'd ever identified it or mapped it that precisely before. And you don't know what's going to happen with this data. I'm not a scientist, but I was hopeful that with the degree of resolution that we brought to the table, that we would at least help the geologists and seismologists to analyze these areas, because these are trenches. These are active volcanic areas that would help them potentially for warning, for helping building the models of how the plates move and how they break, because that has huge implications for coastal communities in the area.
Yeah, that tsunami from a few years ago killed what, 250, oh, how was it, 1,000 people?
Yeah, a lot. Those are some of the most deadly natural occurrences ever. And yeah, it'd be great to be able to predict them better, to be quite frank.
There was a science dive also there, and they found some unusual bacterial mats. They were orange, yellow, and
Well, that
so
was in the
forth.
that was actually more in the Mariana Trench. We saw a little bit
Mariana.
of that in the Java Trench. The Java Trench was distinctive because that's probably where we saw the strangest animal we saw on the whole expedition. It was a stalked Ascidian. I mean, it looks like a jellyfish, but it was different. I mean, we didn't quite know what the heck it was. It was like a big fat sea cucumber with a cable on its back, but it was moving and it turned right in front of our lander. Like it smelled it, came by to visit it, but it didn't have any real motility capability, but it sort of did. It was just strange as hell. I'll never forget seeing it on the video from a lander with my chief scientist standing next to me, because they called me from my stateroom and said, "Hey, Victor, you got to come and see this." I go down there and they're pulling it up on the screen. And we're both with our mouths open looking at this thing. And I turn to my Scottish again, who's very gruff, but brilliant individual. I said, "What is that?" And he turned to me and he said, "Victor, I don't have a fucking clue." And this is like the world's expert on deep ocean biology. And that's when you knew you were doing some really cool science.
Yeah, that picture of it is really amazing. I think you all nicknamed it the Snoop Dogg.
Yeah, Snoop Dogg, because it kind of looked like a dog's head and it was snooping around the lander. So it kind of made sense. So that's an homage also to the great, rapper.
We've been talking about landers. Can you briefly describe what those are?
Oh, yeah, those are the unsung heroes of the expedition. We built three of them, and they were capable of going all the way down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, which is a fact or a feat in and of itself. And I gave them some cool science fiction names, but they had cameras, they had soil sampling ability, definitely had biologic sampling capability with traps, the video, and they would go down not just to collect scientific data, but they also acted as navigation beacons for the submersible. They tended to drop pretty vertically true. So if we dropped a lander at a specific geo coordinate, we had pretty good faith it would land within 100 to 150 meters of that point. The submersible tended to drift a little bit more, maybe a lot more because it was so big. And so when I got to the bottom, one of the first things I would do is I would navigate to one of the landers so I would know where I was. And from there, I could do vectors and do dead reckoning to navigate on the bottom of the seafloor. We got really good by the end of the five deeps where we could triangulate the position of the submersible on the bottom by using multiple landers, kind of like an acoustic GPS on the bottom of the seafloor, because of course GPS doesn't work underwater. It doesn't, radio doesn't work. So we had to come up with other methods of navigation, and it worked pretty well.
Let's go fourth dive, challenge 35,000. Let me see if I get this number right. 35,843 feet deep.
Yeah.
That's far deeper than all the other deepest parts. I mean,
yeah, that was
amazing.
Super Bowl day. Yeah, that when we'd done 3 deep ocean trenches before that, but everybody knew Challenger Deep was Super Bowl day. And so on the whole cruise out of Guam, you could feel the tension rising. Everybody knew that they had to be on their A game, including myself as the pilot, and that this is the big deal. And not just dive at once, but we were going to go for multiple dives in a short period of time. No one had ever done that. It was a hand-picked crew. These were literally the best people on the planet Earth to do this. And you felt like you were on a Super Bowl team. And so prepping the sub for that first dive to the bottom, understanding, what to do if anything went wrong, this, that, and the other, it was intense. And gosh, I'll never forget, trying to get to sleep the night before. It was hard. But eventually I calmed myself down and did it, and then got up, at 5 a.m. to pre-flight the sub, and everything was green, and we didn't have to abort, and we made the dive. And going down for 4.5 hours, that first dive is intense. And when I breached, 8,600, 8,700 meters, the depth of the Atlantic, which had been the deepest it had ever gone before, for me, that was uncharted territory. Now, 3 other people had done it before, and their vehicles had survived, but I'd never been in this submersible, fully assembled, going down to that depth before. You couldn't test it. And so I was really hoping it would make it all the way down without having to abort. And it did. I swear, getting to watching that depthometer flip to 10,000 meters was kind of a big event for me. It's like, oh wow, I am really deep.
Yeah.
I've only got another 1,000 meters to go. And when I got 200 feet off the bottom and I started dropping the ballast weights to slow my descent and hover on the bottom, I went, oh my God, I'm actually going to get to the bottom of Challenger Deep. And then when the lights slowly started picking up the bottom, the tan color of the bottom of the ocean, it was just such a, oh my gosh moment. And the first thing I did, it felt extraordinary. I felt so proud of the team and everybody that had made it possible. That's why, when I first got down there, it's the first thing I said. I said, yeah, I'm at the bottom, but I said, you guys did this. You guys built it. You maintained it. And this is all of us being able to build this amazing machine. And most importantly, then I came back up and it was a huge celebration. The first person that greeted me and shook my hand was Don Walsh, the first person at the bottom of the ocean. That was really special. And then I got a big hug from Patrick, the man who designed and built the submersible, and my expedition leader, my captain. And then 3 days later, we did it again. that was pretty intense too, because when you're on that second dive in 3 days, you definitely have the thought in your head of, maybe there's a reason this hasn't been done before. But
yeah, because this is the first.
Yeah, that was definitely a first.
This is a big deal where the same vehicle is going down within days. I mean, that's no small accomplishment given how much, damage or impact or.
Oh yeah. We dove it below 10,500 meters 4 times in 10 days. That's just remotely not even done before. And that is a testament to the design of the submersible, designed by John Moransby and Tom Blades, and the building by Patrick and everybody else, and the maintenance crew that were just amazing, that troubleshot all sorts of things and made it diveable. It was just an extraordinary event. I mean, when we eventually, left the scene after, diving, actually it was 5 times over 10 days below 10,000 meters. Everybody was exhausted, but gosh, what a sense of accomplishment for everyone. We were so proud of just everybody and what we had brought to the table technologically.
I also saw that when you were down there, you were surprised about all the amount of life forms that you saw. Can you describe it for us?
Yeah, I think people who've been down there, I think in the Trieste, they didn't get to see anything because they weren't down there very long and they were silted out. Jim Cameron went down and he described it as kind of lifeless. That kind of surprised me because I actually saw a lot more life. But then I think he was down there for about 2 hours. I was down there for 4 hours twice. So I was down there for over 8 hours in the 2 dives that I did. And I, went down a lot more after that in the years that followed. But on my dives, I actually saw quite a few holothurians, some little, caterpillar-like worms come out of the surface. I saw, a little bit of bacterial mats on the rocks on the southern edge of the Challenger Deep. So it was more like the desert to me, where it wasn't lifeless, but it was sparse. But it was definitely a lot more life than I expected.
Yeah, could you imagine any organism that survives at that extreme depth? I mean, it's just incredible.
Well, it's normal for them. I mean, the holothurians down there, which is the primary animal that you see, they don't have eyes, they don't have pigments, they just live from what falls from the surface. But to them, that's normal. I mean, you're the oddity, you're the alien, and, life finds a way.
Well, speaking of that, you all found life that were living off of methane, and can you
Yeah. Actually, the most robust bacterial colony we found, and this is actually an interesting point of exploration, wasn't until one of the very last dives I made in Challenger Deep. It was the second to last dive I ever made there. And I made 15 dives in the Challenger. And it was with Dylan Taylor, someone who helped fund the scientific part of one of my last expeditions. And we found a bacterial mat colony that was just so dense. It was on the western edge of the eastern pool of the Challenger Deep. And we dove there because Dylan and I were trying to decide, well, where should we dive? I said, well, let's dive this place no one's ever been before, in the eastern pool of the Challenger Deep. And we did. And there were these red and gold, like mats of bacteria. They were so big, you could see the individual bacteria like moving in the water. And it was just extraordinary. This wasn't any just chemosynthesis chemical reaction. These were living creatures in mass colonies. It was absolutely undoubtedly the case there. And in those environments, there's no light. So they are not living off chemosynthesis. They're living off of the methane, the minerals in the rocks. This is a completely different form of life than you see up on land. So it very much, I told Dylan when we were down there, I said, yeah, there's life on other planets. It's going to look more like this than anything we have up there on the surface. And he was, as a big space guy, Dylan was very excited by that. He thought it was just a transformational dive. He said it was a more exciting adventure than going into space was.
Yeah, just incredible. Let me take you to a spot not far away. I believe it's called the Horizon Deep.
Oh,
And
yeah.
yeah, tell us about that dive. That was pretty
That was intense.
pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Me and the Horizon Deep have an interesting relationship. The Challenger Deep was almost peaceful. I've compared it to like climbing around inside the pyramids. It was relatively quiet. It was sandy and silty, a lot of rocks on the edges, but it was what you expected. The Horizon Deep was chaotic. A lot of rubble, a lot of sharp edges all over the place. It was interesting. And there was a chance that it was even deeper than the Challenger Deep. It was within the margin of error on the sonar maps that we made. We had the most accurate maps anyone had ever made at that point. So had to physically measure it. So sent down landers, sent down the sub with me in it, 4.5 hours from the bottom. It turned out the Horizon Deep was only about 110 meters shallower than Challenger Deep. So that's close. We were pulling for it because we were looking forward to rewriting all the textbooks, but it was shallower. But after about 15 minutes on the bottom, more than 4 hours from the surface, like so many of my alarm systems tripped off, a lot of them, like all at once. Very unnerving. In a very small enclosed environment, klaxons going off, and I'm going, what the hell? I didn't detect a hull breach. I wouldn't have realized it anyway. So I said, what's going on? And that's when the training kicks over. That's where the panic response that you've trained for kicks over. And it's like, okay, analyze the problem. What's the root cause of all this? And fortunately, I think I identified it pretty darn quickly. I said, I've got water coming into one of my batteries, and it's dumping all that current into the system. I said, I got to isolate that because it's going to start melting things outside the pressure vessel. So theoretically, I had the deepest fire in a submersible ever, at almost 11,000 meters. It was outside the pressure vessel, but there could have been a power surge in the capsule. I still would have survived because even if everything had been fried electronically, the weights would have dropped and I would have come back to the surface. But there's always that wonder, would a huge power surge have, frozen the connections and stranded me on the bottom? You don't know, but you need to take care of business. And I did. I isolated the problem. I shunted off that area from everything else. And then after, 20 seconds, everything was not back to normal, but it was stabilized like a patient. And quite frankly, I had the other half of the submarine completely fine. I stayed down another hour exploring because I knew that we weren't going to be able to dive after that. The sub was too damaged. So I tried to do as much science as I could. I would not have done that if there'd been another passenger in the submersible, because my responsibility would have been to the passenger, not myself. But I'm able to take greater risks when it's just me in there. And that's what I did. So I figured, you know what, let's do some science while I can. And after about an hour, I said, I think I should probably go up now. And I did. And when I got to the surface, it turned out that the fire started again because it got oxygen. They had to put it out while I was in the sub. And when I got back out, you could smell a lot of stuff burning. It's not a story I think Triton likes for me to tell, but hey, that's test pilot stuff. That's prototype stuff. And after that, we diagnosed the issue and eventually we solved it and it never happened again. So by the time I eventually sold the system to Gabe Newell's Inkfish organization, after 4 years of diving, that sub is bulletproof. And it's out there diving in the Pacific now.
Yeah, but that was ballsy keeping going because you kind of skipped over a little bit. If that surge had a danger of going into the capsule, and if that happened, your air and
the life support system is all analog. We designed the life support so it was not dependent on electricity, but there was a very, very, very small chance that enough of a power surge throughout all the circuits of the submersible could have welded the circuits together. I don't think that could have happened with the drop weights, but that would have been a problem because the backup for the drop weights, if they didn't release for some reason, I could release the thrusters or the batteries, but that required using the electrical system to shoot a burn wire and to cut the cable. But if the electricity had failed, that would have been impossible. And if the electricity had been shorted out, I wouldn't have had thrusters either. So it just, I had to deal with the problem. I had to deal with it fast, and I did. And there you go. But the design of the submersible was so strong and everything was so isolated. I never really had any question about my ability to get back to the surface somehow.
Well, that goes back to what I originally was talking about. It comes back to the pilot, not the technology. It's the pilot.
Well, the design philosophy I had for Triton was I told them that the laws of physics would have to be violated for me not to come back. That's how I want this thing designed. And that's what they did. And that's why, torture testing that design in my head over and over again, I struggled to figure out a way for me not to come back with that design. And that's why I was able, I think, frankly, to stay quite calm because I knew my life wasn't in jeopardy, really. Maybe I was too optimistic, but that's how I felt.
The fifth dive is in the Arctic, Mallory Deep, but en route, you decided to take
the Malloy Deep, not Mallory, the Malloy Deep.
Malloy Deep. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Malloy Deep. Now I'm thinking of the climber.
Yeah, you're thinking of the climber. That's fine.
But en route, you decided to take a little detour to the Titanic. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's always a fun story just because we were doing the 5 East expedition and we had to go through the Panama Canal. And when you draw a line from the Panama Canal to the Malloy Deep in the Arctic, I swear to God, you go right over where the Titanic is. And it was almost a chuckle where we're looking at the map and we're like, oh, we got to dive the Titanic. Now, it is true. We tried to dive the Titanic in 2018, the year before, to test drive the submersible. I mean, our testing of the submersible is going to happen at the Titanic. But there was a hurricane that year. And we tried,
Yeah,
but
you
we
got
had to,
weathered off.
yeah, we weathered off, and that was a real frustrating thing that delayed the expedition a bit, but it is what it is. But we ended up diving in 2019, and National Geographic came along, and we did a 1 hour special with them, and it was the first crewed dive to the Titanic in 15 years. And we were able to do a pretty exhaustive survey. I was able to do the dumbest thing I ever did on the diving expeditions, which was the only solo dive to the Titanic. That was the most dangerous dive I ever did, probably for a variety of reasons,
And
and I
why is
never did
that?
that again. Well,
Why is it?
what I
Yeah.
discovered is that the currents of the Titanic can be quite strong, up to a knot or a knot and a half, which is the maximum speed of the sub, which means you get in the wrong place at the wrong time, you do not have full control of the sub. And wrecks are extremely dangerous because they can impale the sub. And the one thing that you are very frightened of that you cannot control with a submersible is if you get entangled. You can't go out and untangle a sub. Now you can jettison maybe the parts of the sub that get entangled, and it was designed that way, but that's something you don't want to do. And there are a lot of cables and ropes around the Titanic, and it's a big wreck, and it's falling apart. So it's very dangerous. In fact, I heard that Jim Cameron actually got stuck on the Titanic once, and the other submersible had to break them free. Another time, a mere submersible got trapped under the stern of the Titanic. So it's happened more than a few times that submersibles have gotten entangled with the wreck. And unlike those dives, I was going with just one submersible. Not only that, the submersible was designed for full ocean depths, so the viewing capability was limited. And it's also extremely helpful to have two sets of eyes. One set of eyes inside looking at the sonar and managing the instruments, and one set of eyes looking outside for obstacles. I was constantly shifting between the two, which was exhausting and also made it riskier. And then finally, that was the first dive I ever made to the wreck. So I was not familiar with it. And I learned later that that's kind of important. So that was not the brightest thing I ever did. And I did the job, I did my survey, and I got to go to the wreck and I got to do it solo. But I never did that again. And I wouldn't suggest anyone ever doing that again.
What was it like seeing the Titanic?
Well, that was the benefit of doing it solo. People go, oh, you're so selfish. Why didn't you take someone with you? Because people, really want to see the Titanic. For me, it's like I wanted to be with the wreck, just me, my sub, and the Titanic. And that was a gift I kind of gave myself, called me selfish, okay, but I went through a lot of trouble and a lot of money to build this vehicle. And it was a very unique, I don't know how anyone can say it wouldn't be a unique experience. To be in a submersible of your own partial design and construction, and you are piloting around the Titanic. It was spooky, but it was also really cool. And I just can't describe it fully, what it was like just to be going along the side of the Titanic, filming it, going around it completely by myself, looking at this historic artifact. It was an extraordinary experience. I make it like, when you dive solo, it's like going on a car trip by yourself. It's completely different than if you go with one of your best friends. They're not, one isn't better or worse. They're just very, very different. It's more contemplative. It's more thoughtful. It's almost a deeper emotion when you do things solo, especially when you're diving solo on the bloody Titanic.
From there, you go to the Malloy Deep, and that's the last of the 5.
Yeah.
And that's up in the Arctic. Tell us a little bit about that dive.
Well, that was a pretty fun dive, to be quite frank, because it was the last of the 5. We had already been through the gauntlet of the Puerto Rican Trench, the Southern Ocean, the Challenger Deep. This was the shallowest of the 5. We knew the sub could do this. But it was cool because no one had ever done a physical dive of the Malloy. And we knew exactly where it was. The Norwegian government was very cooperative. It was on the ice. And, we filled up the ship with everyone that we could fit. And it was just an exciting time. And we did some really cool scientific dives afterwards and saw a lot of wildlife because it was shallower. Saw a lot of cool rocks, and we saw some of the most jumbled terrain we had ever seen. I mean, stuff with like overhangs underwater. It was like a mountain range down there, and the scientists loved that. I was able to take down a geologist for the Royal Geographic Society. I was able to take down my chief scientist. I was able to do the dive to the bottom of the ocean, and that was kind of tricky because it turned out there was a lot of iron near the bottom of the ocean, and it caused my compass to go haywire. So it was actually really hard to navigate. I kept trying to find my way to the lander, which we were pretty sure was on the absolute bottom. And it was really hard. It took over like an hour, hour and a half for me to just rendezvous with the lander because the navigation was difficult. But eventually I got there. And then when I came back to the surface, they shot fireworks and cannon, and it was a big celebration. And literally we would just, we would just sit around the galley that night just going, holy cow, we did it. Wow, that was cool.
Now, there's one. There's two other places I want to go in your journeys. Now, I want to take you to the Red Sea, and there was first this danger in Yemen, and a danger of somebody possibly boarding and taking over the ship. Tell us about that.
Well, we dove in the Red Sea before that incident. That wasn't an incident; that was more of a condition. But we were taking the ship around the world again to do more dives after the 5 deeps, and no one had ever taken a manned submersible to the bottom of the Red Sea. Got to do that. So we got on the ship. We went to a couple of the deepest areas, the Suakin Deep, and I was able to take a Saudi Arabian to the bottom of the Red Sea, which they were really happy about. It was supposed to be a prince of the royal family, but as happens out there at the last minute, he had to cancel. So literally a guest 20-something engineer from Saudi Arabia happened to be on the ship working some of the lander and other issues. I turned to him and said, hey, you want to go to the bottom of the Red Sea? He was like, yes. we went down together. It was actually kind of funny because there was a major, I think, from the Royal Saudi Defense Forces, and he was kind of our minder on the ship. He was, I think, quite upset that I didn't ask him to go because technically he was senior. But I was going to take the young engineer. That was the right thing to do. And I think that caused us some problems later, but it was worth it. So we did that. We went to the brine lakes. I actually dove the submersible into the brine lake, which had never been done before.
Yeah, you got to tell us that story because that's got to be one of the stranger things.
Yeah, it was interesting. At the bottom of the Red Sea, people don't realize it, but there are these lakes at the bottom, like it's 6,000 meters, because there's no real good exit to the Red Sea. So the water evaporates and you get a lot of salt concentration. At the bottom of the Red Sea, it gets so hot that the salt kind of condenses. It's kind of like the Dead Sea, but it's underwater. And so when you get to the bottom of the Red Sea, you can see this like lake. It looks like milk, like at the bottom of the trench. And you can actually go into it, but no one had ever done that because they didn't want to risk their ROV or AUV because you knew that the temperature was going to be really high because it's holding that heat. It's salt. Well, we got down there. I was with my chief scientist. We're cruising along the so-called shoreline, investigating all these beautiful colors and some of the bizarre creatures that obviously had been living there. And then I said, I'd really like to try and go into the lake. And being a Scottish adventurer that he is, he said, okay. So it's Jameson. He's awesome. So I really slowly tried to get into the lake, and we literally bounced off because the surface tension on the top of the brine lake was enough that I didn't have enough inertia to get through it. I was like, that was weird. I bounced like a ball. So I went up a little bit higher, and then I built up some speed. And then we punctured through it. The heat sensors on the sub, redlined. I don't really know how hot it was, but I know it literally started getting warm in the capsule, the titanium capsule. And then it went really milky white for a little bit, and then it went completely clear. Because I don't know how the refraction works underwater in a brine lake, but we do now. We could see quite clearly. And there wasn't any life that I could see, but it was bizarre. And then I think after even just 20 or 30 seconds, we looked at each other going, let's try and get back up here because I don't know how much damage this is doing. It turned out it did a little bit of damage to our sensors and the thrusters. And then I built up some speed. Now there was a little bit of worry that would we bounce down this time, but I punctured through again, and we got back up. And of course, when we got to the surface, they were, the maintainers were not quite happy with me because they said I damaged a lot of the gear. But I said, you know what? It was worth it for science. You got to push the boundaries sometime. And so we did the Red Sea.
Must have been beside himself.
Oh, he was pretty excited. He said that was bloody awesome. And yeah, we had a drink together after that. That was cool. I think it's the only time it's ever been done that I know of, because I don't know any other sub that can get down that deep. And who would do that? Who's going to damage their submersible deliberately? I could because it was mine, but no scientific or government organization is going to do that. So I think that'll last for a while. And then we got off board. The Saudi major was really mad at me. I thought he was going to arrest me when we got to port, but I actually left in the middle of the night and got out of there. It did that a lot on my expeditions, it turns out. And then and then that's when we had to take it through the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the southern exit to the Red Sea. And so we actually had to hire some mercenaries and pick up guns in the middle of the Red Sea. I was certainly not on board. In fact, we went to skeleton crew because we didn't want any risk. We ended up being part of a military convoy, in addition to having barbed wire and mercenaries on the vessel to protect it from Somali pirates. And it was fine. And they got through, but we had some fun pictures of the pressure drop as an armed vessel for a couple of days. She's been through a lot. That ship has, legendary status now. It started out as a sub hunter in the Cold War, hunting Russian submarines in the North Atlantic, and then it became a drug interdiction ship at Southern Command. Then it became a ship for NOAA doing oceanographic research. Then it did the 5 deeps under my private ownership. Now it's working for Inkfish in the Pacific, a different marine organization. That ship's history is epic. Good for her.
Yeah, good ship. Speaking of ships, one of the last things I wanted to talk to you about is you found and dove to some of the deepest shipwrecks there are.
No, they're the two deepest. They are the deepest.
Yeah. And the Samuel Roberts. Tell us about those dives.
Yeah, well, I was 20 years in the Navy, and I'm an amateur military historian, so I knew about some of the big battles that had been fought in the Philippines. And we were out there diving the Philippine Trench, which is one of only 4 10,000-meter trenches, and no one had ever dived it before. So I took down a Filipino PhD in oceanography. We dove the Philippine Trench, and I made room in the schedule about another week. So I said, we're really close to the battlefield off Samar, where one of the most intense surface battles of World War II had ever been fought. And I said, yeah, let's look for some of the American wrecks there, because we know they're in the trench. They'd be really deep. It's really hard.
Battle of Leyte Gulf?
Yeah, it was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where an American destroyer flotilla took on Japanese battleship squadrons, and they won. It was it's an epic battle, one of the greatest last stands in world naval history. It is arguably the greatest naval last stand in American naval history. And so I felt honor bound to take a look for him, see if we could find him, to honor the people that died there, because I know it gives some closure to the relatives and others if you can find the shipwreck, just to show how bravely they fought. Finding shipwrecks on the bottom of the ocean is really, really hard. And we did not have AUVs or ROVs to help us. So we had to use a lot of brain power to try and figure out where they probably were, and then to use the submersible as kind of an ROV AUV. And it could go down to any depth. And first we found the Johnston in 2021 by standing on the very broad shoulders of the Vulcan group, which found parts of the Johnston at a shallower depth, but we found the main part of the hull because we could go down deeper than any ROV. ROVs are typically limited to about 6,000 meters. We could go down even further, and that's where we found the majority of the wreck, and positively identified it as the Johnston. We came back a year later, and we looked for a week. We were looking for the Gambier Bay, which was a small aircraft carrier because it was bigger, thought that'd be easier to find. And instead, we happened upon the Samuel B. Roberts, and were able to find that wreck, and that became the deepest shipwreck in history. So in 2 successive years, we found the deepest shipwreck ever. Samuel B was even harder. People don't appreciate the Samuel B. Roberts was at over 6,700 meters of depth, which is 50% deeper than the Titanic. And it's like 1/10 the size of Titanic. And it's just in one piece. That was really hard to find. But we did. And hats off to Tim McDonald, who found the first big piece of debris of the Sammy B. I dove the next day and was able to find the majority of the wreck. And and we were able to retell the story of that battle because we found the wrecks, and people that had no idea the heroism of the crews that day, we got to tell that story.
And as a Navy, someone in the Navy, that's got to have a certain more important, more poignant experience, because your fellow Navy personnel were down there from decades before.
Yeah, I thought so. I felt an immense amount of privilege. I get a little choked up about it as well. Quite frankly, I do, because the first person to see these wrecks since they went down in 1944 wasn't a fellow naval officer. And, we try and take care of our own. And it added to the event that it was, a Navy person who made the effort to find these wrecks and to honor these sailors who passed away. It would have been fine if a civilian had done it, but I think it was even more special. And I know the Navy appreciated it very much, that I did feel a sense of personal responsibility and had the capability that I could actually do this for those crews.
Yeah, and it means a lot, to those families, and it again brings back to the service just the bravery of the courage that these sailors exhibited. Just amazing.
Yeah, I will tell you that we made self-made documentaries of a lot of our dives, and by far the most number of views of any video we ever published was finding the Samuel B. Roberts, by an order of magnitude. Not the scientific dives, not the dives to Challenger Deep. It was finding the Sammy B.
Yeah,
and the Johnston.
Story behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent work for doing that. Can you share us, I'm going to switch gears and go more philosophical with you. Can you share with us, well, first of all, let me ask you this. The Victor Vescovo that started and made that initial call to Triton to say, hey, I want to make a sub, to the one who's sitting here now, how did it change you?
Oh my gosh. A lot, on multiple axes. It only reinforced my viewpoint that human beings are capable of so much more than they think they are. If someone had told me 10 years ago, yeah, one day you're going to work with Triton and EOS and all these other organizations to build and dive the deepest diving submersible in history and find shipwrecks and this, I'm like, I don't know anything about that. And yet we have the capacity to learn. And it just takes commitment to do something extraordinary with the significant risk of failure and potential embarrassment that would cause as well. And so it's emboldened me to really affirm that, yes, you can do extraordinary things. You just have to stick with it and make good decisions and hire the right people and frankly, just make the bloody commitment and get it done. And it also definitely bit me with the bug of ocean exploration. It really became branded in my consciousness now of how little we know about the ocean. I have directly experienced that with people that have spent their lives studying the ocean, that were mesmerized by the things we were discovering, where now I'm incredibly passionate about trying to map the seafloor. We still have not mapped 3/4 of the ocean. Half of planet Earth is still completely unmapped and unexplored. And just like there had been no one diving the 5 oceans, that's an affront to me. I can't believe that in the year 2025, we have not mapped half of our planet. And so I'm making a very strong commitment to build a ship that hopefully can set the standard for just how fast and efficiently we can map the deep ocean, because no one has really applied the proper energy to do that. And that's what I bring to the table. I bring a certain business and technological viewpoint that is not academic or government, that's efficiency driven, not other criteria driven. And so that's one thing I'm involved in a lot lately.
A big part of, I think, the evolution of your journey has been controlling fear, if I could put it that simply. Can you tell
I think
us?
I think the highest priority that I've learned to do over my 59 years on this earth, it's actually risk management. Fear is an element of that, but the primary thing that I'm glad that I've been able to do is figure out how to manage risk, to get very difficult things done in as safe a manner as possible, and being disciplined about how you go after very difficult things. Now, when you're operating at the very edge of technology and extreme environments, whether they're in the air and sea or space, yeah, there's going to be some fear because mankind is not meant to be in those areas. But I think that's where the training comes in. I have a lifetime of experiencing very extreme situations where now it's not that I don't have fear, it's just that I so automatically compartmentalize it and channel it and just get on with it that I think it makes things look easier than they are. And I think that you talk to any test pilot, that's kind of how they are. And that's what you're kind of selecting for when you're looking for test pilots. I've just kind of been self-trained in that. And think I have the personality and mentality where that comes easier than it does for other people. I'm very analytical. I'm kind of introverted, believe it or not. And I just tend to externalize things and not get emotional about things at all.
Yeah. Amundsen would be proud.
Yeah, that's one of the most extraordinary compliments I can ever receive from anyone. Is I wish I'd been able to meet the gentleman, but all I can hope is that he would have looked at the expeditions I've been on and would have nodded in his very quiet Norwegian way and approved. That would have been the highest compliment I could ever have achieved in this lifetime.
Yeah, wouldn't that be cool to go back in time and just be able to sit down with those great explorers?
Yeah.
Amundsen, Shackleton, the list goes on and on. You just wish you could sit down and have a pint with them and say, what were you thinking? How was it like?
Yeah, I know. I did go to Shackleton's grave in South Georgia Island, and I toasted him and poured some whiskey over his grave. But yeah, you can't do that. So all you can do is do the best you can and stand on their shoulders and try and push the ball forward. And I'm hoping that I've done that, and more importantly, encouraged other people, particularly young people, to understand that there is still a lot to explore. There is still a lot to do. It's just more difficult in some respects, but it can be done. And you should never be intimidated by those challenges.
Yeah, in that vein, I've had the opportunity to talk with a number of, let's say, the up and coming generation of explorers. What advice would you give them?
Get out there. I think it's too easy in the digital age for people to get wrapped up in the digital world, in their own personalities, and not experience the real world. To explore, you've got to get out in the analog world and also not be intimidated by things being too difficult. You have to be persistent. I think it was Calvin Coolidge who had that wonderful quote about the greatest power in the world is just persistence. And that's what it takes. Yeah. You're going to fail a lot in this life. But if you want your life to have meaning, if you want to have that drive to get up in the morning and do great things, you just have to be persistent. You have to have some degree of imagination and vision and find people that are like that. And you will find yourself in good company that enable you. One of the biggest frustrations I have are people that are of, quite high net worth. And it just boggles my mind that they just seem to want to spend more and more money to become marginally more comfortable or to get the next larger yacht or the next larger mansion. For heaven's sake, apply those resources to developing technology. Pick a pet project, for heaven's sake. Medical, physics, chemistry, and let's try and make some additional breakthroughs because you never know where they will go. That will help humanity in general. Let's work on that. And that's what I've done with, my wealth. Like, what else am I going to do with it? And people, what frustrates me so much is how people are so surprised that I did what I did. This, nobody from Texas, who had some money, but I went and did this. It's like, why didn't you? Or people ask me, so what? Or the biggest question I get all the time now is, well, what are you up to now? I have to confess, part of me is like, well, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, but
Yeah, good advice. Well, Victor, this has been just a great conversation. Like I say, as a person who's loved the ocean all his life, I've greatly appreciate what you've done, and
Thank you.
it cannot be overstated that you've, with this technology and the testing of this, you've certainly opened up that next generation of oceanographic exploration, and and it's pretty cool. I think that's a legacy that's going to pay dividends and dividends for a long time. So good on you.
I hope so. In fact, I might end this with something that it's rare that you have the ability to see, like in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life. What would things have been like if you hadn't done what you did or even existed? I got sent an AI generated article from like it was from The Economist on what would have happened if we hadn't built this submersible with Trident and done the five deeps. And basically the conclusion of this article was that, China would own the deep ocean. They built the Fenzhou, the 3-person full ocean depth submersible. They would have the only full ocean depth system in the world. They would have done the five deeps. They would have had the first woman to the bottom of the ocean. They would have found the deepest shipwrecks. And they would have those rights to say, we have the technology and no one else does, which could have had potentially major, at the margin, soft power impacts and it would have just even further deflated those in the West going, let's give up because China's doing everything now. I'm just so happy that we were able to do it. And I'm kind of frustrated that no government did this. It had to be an individual stepping up. And we need more people doing things like that to maintain our way of life, I think, and not give up.
Absolutely. There's so much to do. Why anybody would just want to sit and just watch it all go by without being just diving in and getting active and seeing the world. It's beyond me, but
yeah, me too.
There you go. But sometimes I'm brain damaged too. People ask me why I go do these things, and not always understand.
I get asked all the time, and I do my best.
All right, Victor. This has just been great. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Sure.
And you be safe out there, and we'll see you down the road.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you down the road when we get together again, share a glass of whiskey, and hear more stories of adventure as told by those who live them. Until then, check us out at michaeljreinhardt.com, where you'll find more of my work as an adventure photojournalist. Photos, videos, and articles of interesting people, mysterious places, and exotic cultures from the wild places of the world.